So what's the theory behind it?
Okay, here's the theory behind it. This is so cool. When a driver moves back and forth, it compresses air. And if it moves back, if it has to move very far, it compresses the air a lot, and the air pushes back. And it's hard to push. If you take one of these subs and go up and push on it, you'll notice it's hard to push the cone in because there's a lot of air pressure behind it. Before my high pressure sub was invented, the way woofers were evaluated by woofer gurus, they'd come up to a woofer or a driver and they'd push on it and see how easy it was to move it back and forth. And if it felt smooth and easy and went far, they go, yeah, this is going to have a lot of bass. And you push on mine and you can't move it. It's like there's a brick wall behind it. And I remember taking it to the first reviewer and he pushed on it. And even in the review he said, we didn't think it was going to work. We didn't think it could move. But move it did, he said. I remember that just like it was yesterday. So the theory behind it is to allow the box pressure to become enormous and somehow overcome it. The size of the box doesn't have anything to do with how much bass comes out. It's how far the driver moves back and forth, multiplied by its area, circumference times pi. So, so I knew that if I had a woofer, a small one, that moved back and forth a lot, it would have as much bass as a big one that only moved back and forth a little bit. So I shrunk the box down. Now, unfortunately, shrinking the box makes the box pressure go high. Normal box pressures are about 0.2, remember that number, 0.2 pounds per square inch. So if it's 100 square inches of woofer, say 50. 50 times 0.2 is whatever that is. What is 50 times 0.2? 10 pounds. 10 pounds. So I went up to 9 psi. I mean, a lot more than 0.2. And there are two 30-inch area drivers in there. So 30, and 30 is 60 times 9. Well, if it were 10, it'd be 600 pounds. So you can see that there's a lot of force in that on those drivers in that box. And there's a lot of air pressure in there. And outside, it's a pussycat, but inside, it's a hurricane.
Right.
And to make it move back and forth that much required something called a high voltage amplifier tracker, because the efficiency is proportional to the high voltage, and the faster it moves. That's a complicated issue, but the faster it moves as it goes back and forth, the more efficient it is. And if it moves back and forth more in the same time period, like let's say it's reproducing 30 hertz, if it's moving back and forth this far, it still moves 30 times a second. Or if it's moving this far, to produce the same 30 hertz, it's got to move 30 times a second. But since it's moving much farther, it's much, much faster. And since it's moving much faster, it's way more efficient. And efficiency, and this is an equation I invented, I came up with it, and it's true. And nobody would believe me at first, but the efficiency is proportional to the square of the back EMF, and the back EMF is proportional to the velocity at which the wires are cutting the magnetic field. And I had a hard time getting people to believe me, but it didn't matter because I brought it out and it worked, and that convinced them.
And that one doesn't use a voice coil, correct? The one that you...
Oh, the one I'm talking about now is the Atmos. That
Okay.
does use the voice coil.
Which is the one you sent me the videos of.
That was the helicopter one. That's 30 psi.
That thing's cool.
Yeah, that's really little.
Is,
I'm going to edit that.
is
Speaking of woofers, your thoughts on the servo drive woofers that a couple companies are coming out with, such as Lynn and a few others are starting to do it? Your thoughts on that?
A servo woofer, what that means is there's a feedback element that's stuck to the cone. And somehow, one way or another, the cone velocity is measured and fed back to the amplifier. And if it's not exactly the right velocity, the amplifier corrects it and makes it the right velocity by sending a corresponding signal to the voice coil. And this is a standard way of reducing distortion. So it's called sensing the voice coil, or sensing the woofer. we sense the motion of the woofer, we generate a feedback signal, the amplifier corrects it so the motion of the woofer is just the way we want it to be. And it's a great idea. And when I first came out with the True Sub, I sensed the woofer. I thought, okay, I'm going to sense the woofer. I need it to have a low distortion. And then I began to listen to it. And I learned something about limits and how we hear and what we hear. And it was utterly unnecessary. As a matter of fact, I liked the way it sounded better without sensing it. For a really interesting reason. At very low frequencies, I mean subsonic, like 15 hertz, if it wasn't sensed, it would make a little more bass. And so I liked it better. In theory, as a practical matter, I chose to not sense my woofers. But I still think it's a great idea for anybody that does. It's not for me at this point, because it's unnecessary.
They've been doing sensing servos for a long time. No, Velodyne's had some since the 80s or something like that.
Yeah, Velodyne's always sensed their woofers until I came out with mine, and then they bagged it. Because I bagged it. And I was selling like crazy, and I think they wouldn't have a subwoofer. I remember David Hall said, you know, God, Bob's making subwoofers that everybody wants, and I'm just making subwoofers that I like. And I thought that was pretty courageous. I mean, it takes courage to make something that only you like, even if the rest of the world doesn't. But, anyway. Bob? Excuse me.
Yes, dear.
Let me turn this thing on.
Yes,
Yes,
dear.
dear.
You know, I can't even turn my phone off.
We had a conversation the other night regarding Infinity, and I remember when a month or two before I saw your Amazings for the first time, they had a set of IRS betas, and I believe they had a servo feedback on it, and that's got to be 25, 30 years ago.
That, I mean, I
512
thought for sure I'd need a servo feedback because all the people I respected in the industry use servo feedback. So I thought I'll put one on too. And I did, and it worked fine. But it turned out I didn't need it.
Can you tell us more about the helicopter stuff?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. I have this new
I'm very
subwoofer.
interested in this. I've heard the theory. I find it fascinating.
I have a subwoofer that's this big. It's got almost 30 psi. So it by the way, the psi, the pounds per square inch of box pressure, is a figure of merit. The more box pressure, the more bass it can have, or the lower it can go, or a combination of both. So my helicopter sub is only this. God, how big is it? You've got the pictures.
Even smaller.
It's
very
probably
small.
like no more than 6 or 7 inches
Yeah,
square.
yeah,
It's
it's
tiny.
It's not even
Nothing
that.
like the size of the cube.
Oh, it's way smaller than the cube.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you can hold it in one hand. And I took it down to the St. James Cathedral, and here's this pipe organ that goes, 60 feet up into the air. Actually, not 60, more like 30. But, and it had all these pipes, and I had the organist record it. We recorded it in that little subwoofer. I'm not going to say it beat the organ. It didn't.
Yeah.
But it came, it wasn't that far behind. It was pretty cool, this one little subwoofer. And it doesn't have a voice coil. It has an electric motor that operates mechanically through a system of push rods and cams and things to make the diaphragm move back and forth. It's actually a really clever push rod that doesn't have any bearings in it. It has a carbon fiber flex thing that flexes. And the helicopter motor, who flies model airplanes? Anybody? Okay. 2,000 watt motors are only this big now. 2,000 watt motors. There's 2 of them in there, so it's like a 4,000 watt amplifier running this thing.